Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Lindsay, and if you are not new here, welcome back. It's good to see you again. Today I am here with a solved case, and I think this case is pretty much awful from start to finish, so I will give you a heads up. Any trigger warning you can think of will probably be applied to this case. I'm going to be talking about Emile Louis, who is one of the biggest serial killers in France. This case is also known in France as the disparus de Yonne, so the missing girls of Yonne, which is a department in France. I know this is a solved case, however, I will not be able to go through this case chronologically. There are quite a few zigzags between the late 70s and the early 2000s, so I'll be jumping back and forth to give you the information as it makes sense. Also, if you do see me looking down here, it's because I need my notes for this case. There is so much to go through and I don't want to be missing anything, so I do apologize. If you like watching the videos, I usually mostly listen to true crime, but if you like watching these videos, I do apologize if I'm looking to the side. I need to read some of the notes. I'll try and look forward as much as I can, but I'm just gonna dive right into it. There's so much to cover. This is a case from Yonne, as I said. It's a department in the southeast of Paris, so southeast of Paris, it's not in Paris. And I will be taking you back to 1989 in Auxerre. Pierre Charrier was the director and founder of the APAJ, so APAJH. It's an association for mentally handicapped and disabled people over the age of 14. It is an association that still runs to this day throughout France. And the founder of this association, Pierre Charrier, found himself in a bit of a scandal in 1989 when he was caught sexually assaulting a mentally disabled girl who was 22 at the time. And although he had tried to justify it by saying that he was helping her meet her sexual needs, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Now, Pierre Menoir, this is a very different Pierre, he had a mentally disabled brother who had spent quite a lot of time in one of those institutions, and Pierre had nothing but good things to say about these institutions. He had nothing but respect for the people who had looked after his brother, but when he found out about the scandal and the sexual assault, he was absolutely outraged, especially when he found out that the victim was still kept in the same institution that was being run by the offender's wife. So she was kept in the same place where the sexual assault had happened. And also he had overheard some people make horrible comments about the victim, essentially calling her a slut or victim blaming her, which was absolutely horrendous. And he was so outraged that he decided to confront these institutions himself. And he got involved in this entire story, but as he was speaking to these institutions, he started hearing rumors about girls who had gone missing in the late 70s. Now, the rumors were that a couple of girls from the DAS had simply vanished and nobody knew what had happened to them. And I'll just clarify for the rest of the video, you'll hear me say the word DAS quite a lot. It's actually DDASS, and that's the Departmental Direction of Health and Social Security. Basically, the main role of it is to protect children whose parents can no longer provide for them or whose parents have abandoned them. Kind of like just social services, I guess. So the DAS is just a system in France, and those girls had all been girls of the DAS. If you hear me say throughout the video, a child of the DAS is just someone who went through that system. So the rumors were that these girls, late 70s, were from that system. They were most likely orphaned or foster children, and they had just gone missing. Nobody knew what had happened, but actually nobody even knew their names. But he still thought, well, there's already one scandal with that sexual assault. What if this is another one? And he started looking into it. So Pierre started looking into these stories just to see if the rumors were true. He wanted to get more information. And again, he didn't even have names to begin with. So he spoke to the director of the institute from which they had gone missing. This was a different director who hadn't worked at the institute back in the late 70s, and he had never heard of these rumors. He'd never heard of these girls, but he did promise Pierre to look into his archives. He said, look, let me have a look, let me see if girls have gone missing, and I'll get back to you. And he did. He found out that 4 young girls had gone missing in 1977, only months apart. We had Christine Marlowe. She disappeared on January 23rd, 1977 at the age of 15. Chantal Gras disappeared a few months later on April 21st at the age of 18. Madeleine de Juste disappeared in July of that year at 21 years old, and Bernadette Lemoine also disappeared in July of that year at the age of 18. So the rumors were true. These 4 girls had just kind of vanished, and Pierre tried to contact the media to draw attention to these disappearances, and they weren't interested. Like, they did not care. Now, fair enough, he was looking into this early 90s, and this had happened in the late 70s, but you would think the media would be interested in a story like this, and they weren't. This was tragic for the young girls because they had been children of the deaths, so it's not like they had immediate family looking for them. Very likely their family didn't know they had gone missing. And even though 3 of them were technically adults, when they disappeared, they were all mentally disabled, so it made them very easy targets for a kidnapping or anything like that. It sounded like they'd gone missing and nobody noticed or cared. Pierre did not know any of these girls. He had only heard of them through these rumors, but for a while he wasn't even sure the rumors were true. Once he found out they were, he wanted justice, he wanted answers. In 1995, he reached out to a very popular 90s TV show called Perdu de vue, which roughly translates to Lost from Sight. Very, very popular TV show in the 90s in France. It's basically like a reality TV show in the sense that the public is involved. And it's basically a TV show where families would go on and talk about someone they want to reconnect with, someone that had disappeared from their lives. And they would be able to reconnect families together, people they'd lost for ages. These days you have social media that really helps, but back in the 90s this was huge. So this was the ideal format to basically get information about these girls, because if they had just vanished or if they had run away, then someone would be able to talk about them or say, hey, I've seen this girl here, or maybe even one of the girls would be able to come forward. But if they were still missing, then maybe they would be able to get information from family members who didn't realize they had gone missing, which is exactly what happened, because unfortunately Christine Marlowe's siblings had been watching that show, and that's when they found out that their sister had not only been placed in an institution, they had no idea she had been placed in an institution. They had all been separated as kids and placed in different foster families. And now they found out that not only was she in an institution, but she had gone missing at 15. Before the show aired, of course, Pierre had to speak to one of the main journalists, Stéphane Minka, and Pierre actually spoke to him for about an hour. He talked about the 4 missing girls and how he basically was begging him to be on this show. And initially Stéphane thought that Pierre was a bit paranoid or intense, and the only reason he actually agreed to do this and put him on his show was because he thought that if he didn't, then Pierre would just keep hounding him, because that's how passionate Pierre was about this. So in order for him to leave him alone, he said, right, let's just put you on the show and air this. And of course, before the episode, they try to get as much information as possible. So Stéphane looked everywhere for these girls. He used all of his connections, all of his contacts, and he found nothing after 1978. There were no traces of benefits, no marriage certificate, none of them had started families. There was virtually no trace for any of them. And the director of the EPAGE at the time refused to comment on this. He insisted that the rumors were baseless. The girls had simply run away. There's no point looking for them. Most of them were adults anyway. And that was the end of it. Stéphane and Pierre didn't think they had run away, especially because one of them, the youngest one, Christine Marlowe, who was 15 when she disappeared, was actually mentally 7 years old. So there was no way she could have planned an escape or survived on her own independently. She didn't have the capacity to thrive on her own. So that was a red flag straight away. There was no way she could have just run away. And given her situation, if she had tried to run away, then you would definitely want to go looking for her. First of all, because she's underage, but also because she couldn't make it on her own. Stéphane managed to track down Madeleine de Juste's sister. Her sister had actually tried looking for Madeleine. They had been separated as children and placed in different foster homes, and she wanted to reconnect with her sister. She had placed ads in the newspapers, but nothing came of it. And Madeleine was last seen at a bus stop in 1977 in July. She was supposed to take the school shuttle back to her home from the institution or from the institute, but she never made it home. And Chantal Gras, another of the missing girls, was supposed to make it home as well. Her nanny, or whoever was looking after her after school, said that she always found it suspicious that Chantal had just vanished, because she would always take the bus back from the institute or the school and always go straight home, but that night she never made it. And what was so weird was that Chantal's biological mom was not surprised Chantal had left. She told Stéphane that the bus driver had actually warned her that Chantal would leave the second she turned 18. He said, "Once Chantal turns 18, she'll leave, you'll see." And when she kind of tried to ask him what he meant, he said, "Look, you'll see, she's going to turn 18 and she's going to leave." And that's exactly what happened. She turned 18 and she left. And her mom didn't even seem alarmed. I guess she thought this was more like a prophecy. And she felt maybe this bus driver, because he spent so much time with the girls driving them to and from schools, he would know more. Maybe he'd seen that happen quite a lot, and that was actually something that did happen. So she wasn't alarmed by his comments. However, Stéphane was like, whoa, this is just very sketchy. Who is this bus driver? And they got a name. The name was Emile Louis. He was in charge of driving the girls to and from the institutes or the schools. He knew them all very well. Obviously, he would drive them twice a day. And Stéphane spoke to police to ask them if they knew of Emile. And one of the police officers there, actually one of the gendarmes, if you're unclear about the difference between gendarme and police, gendarme belongs to the military and police belongs to the state or something like that. So there is a difference, but there was a gendarme who worked at the station and he was very familiar with Emile, so Stéphane wanted to speak to him. Christian Jambert, the gendarme, spoke to Stéphane and told him that he was very interested in Emile because in the late 70s, young girls had gone missing and all of them knew him very well, knew Emile very well. And Stéphane was like, yeah, that's what I'm calling you for. That's exactly what I'm looking into. There's 4 missing girls. And Christian Jambert was like, well, actually, I have 3 more names for you. Françoise Lemoine, Bernadette's sister. So Bernadette Lemoine was one of the 4 Stéphane was aware of. But her sister had also gone missing. She disappeared in March 1975 at 27 years old. Jacqueline Weiss, she disappeared on April 4th, 1977 at 18 years old. And Martine Renaud, she disappeared on September 26th, 1979 at the age of 16. Stéphane could not believe that there were more than 4 girls, but Jambert had been investigating these disappearances since the very early 80s, so he had a couple extra names. The TV show aired on March 25th, 1996, so the Perdu de Vue TV show aired that night, and the host of the show actually was very interested in this story because he himself had been a child of the Das, just like the girls, so this was very close to him. The TV show was very, very popular back then, so as I said, a lot of people watched that show. And because of how popular this show was, this really helped gather quite a lot of information regarding the girls, more than they ever would have had without the show. Before I continue with this story, I do need to go back to 1981. So this is when Jambert started looking into the disappearances, but that very year, a farmer who had been clearing out or cleaning one of his barns in one of his fields discovered a foot sticking out of a pile of hay. And the body was so decomposed that they couldn't even tell if it was female or male. They did find feminine clothing beneath the body, so they immediately assumed it was a Jane Doe, but they also found her hands and feet were tied and she had been gagged. The experts said that she had been dead for about 2 to 3 years, and Jambert was assigned this case, so he immediately looked into disappearances around the late 70s, which is how he got the names of the 6 missing girls. Now, I say 6 because he only had names of 6 girls. He did not have the name of Christine Marlowe yet. He only found out about Christine Marlowe through Stéphane, because she had been reported missing to police and not the gendarmerie. A bit wild that they wouldn't cross over the information, but at the time he wasn't aware of her disappearance, so he only knew of 6. So once he found this Jane Doe, he was looking for someone to match, and he found out about these girls missing. However, none of them were a match to the body found in the barn. While he was hitting a wall, one of his friends, Jacques Moreau, was asking for his help regarding a missing girl. Jacques Moreau's mother-in-law was actually a foster mom for children of the deaths, and Sylviane Lesage, a girl she used to foster a couple of years back, went missing. She just disappeared, and she was one of the few people who knew of Sylviane's disappearance, so in order to get more information, she told her son-in-law because she knew he was friends with Jean-Bert, who was an officer, so maybe he could look into it and figure out where Sylviane had gone, because she left her son behind. She was never seen again. Jean-Bert was way too busy trying to solve these 6 missing girls and also who the Jane Doe was in that barn, so he basically just kept ignoring him or just not looking into it. And eventually one night they went to a party together and Jacques confronted him and said, "Are you gonna look into this case?" And that's when Jean-Bert said, "You know what? I have a Jane Doe, you're looking for a missing girl, what if they're the same person?" And the next day they checked dental records, and that's when they matched the body in the barn to Sylviane Lesage, the missing woman. Sylviane was born in 1958 in Algeria, and she was abandoned at birth, so she had gone from foster home to foster home. She eventually made her way to France, where she ended up staying with Gilberte Binoche Le Menorel. She met Mr. Lesage when she was only 18, so that's how she got her last name. They got married when she was 18, so she was now Sylviane Lesage, and they got a son together. They had a son named Cedric. However, her husband was a petty criminal. He spent most of his time going to jail, being in prison, and she spent most of her time on her own. We really don't know a lot about Sylviane, aside from the fact that she was mostly very lonely. It was just her and her son, and a lot of people believe that she probably felt like there was something missing in her life, that she probably felt that she was very unhappy. I am not sure if she actually had a mental disability herself. However, she was a very easy target because of her emotional state and her loneliness. In February 1981, she left her son with a neighbor. She told her neighbor that she was going out for the day. She was going to Paris. But she never came back, and after a couple of days, the neighbor who still had Sylviane's son reached out to the only other person who knew Sylviane, that was Gilberte, her foster mom. So that's when Gilberte reached out to her son-in-law, Jacques Moreau, who reached out to Jean-Bert, and they eventually matched her to the body found in the field. Once the Jane Doe was identified as Sylviane Lesage, Jean-Bert and Jacques Moreau started looking for a suspect, and it really didn't take them long to find out about Gilberte's partner, Emile Louis, who was also the bus driver of the 6 girls who had gone missing. Now, there were quite a few rumors going around that Sylviane was Emile's mistress, and she allegedly spent quite a lot of time in his bus, or they would meet up quite frequently. It was also believed that the day she left for Paris, she was meeting up with a lover who could very well have been Emile Louis. So this is when Jean-Bert realized that the 6 missing girls and Sylviane Lesage had quite a few things in common. They had all been foster children, children of the deaths. Most of them attended the same schools and institutions, and every single one of them knew Emile Louis. And now I am going to take you back even further. I'm going to give you a bit of background on Emile Louis before I move forward with this story. But Emile was born on January 21st, 1934 in the Yonne, the department southeast of Paris. He had been abandoned at birth, so he also was a child of the deaths, and he didn't find out he was adopted until he was 14 or 15, which made him very angry. It made him very upset, and I can understand why finding out at such a late age that you're adopted would be very upsetting. He immediately resented his biological parents for abandoning him. He always referred to himself as a bastard after that. He had always been known as a liar. He was quite a troublemaker even in school. His foster mom was very cold and strict, and he seemed to have a lot of self-loathing that would translate into misogyny or a hatred towards women. That's how it would manifest. At the end of World War II, the Resistance found out that his sisters had slept with German soldiers. Now, that's unclear whether or not that was consensual, but the Resistance found out that his sisters slept with German soldiers, and they publicly shaved his sisters' heads, which honestly triggered him for the rest of his life. He was enraged by this retaliation. He promised to avenge his sisters, and he eventually did. At the age of 14, he set a barn on fire, and it was a barn that belonged to one of the men who had shaved one of his sister's head. But what he always leaves out of this story is that he was the one who snitched on his sisters. So he was the one who told the Resistance where to find his sisters. So how could he possibly be upset about what they'd done when he was the one who allowed it to happen? The judge actually deemed him irresponsible and demented, so he never faced consequences for setting that barn on fire. And throughout the years, psychiatrists who evaluated him often thought that he was a psychopath, but a few of them considered him a pervert. He had been sexually assaulted at summer camp when he was a teenager. However, he always minimized the situation by saying that it really wasn't that bad and that over time things kind of fade away. So he always claimed it barely affected him. However, many believe that his entire childhood explains a lot of his behavior later on in his adult life, though it doesn't excuse it. At the age of 18, he joined the French Foreign Legion, which is basically a branch of the military. He fought in the war in Indochina for about 2 years. He came back with medals, and the second he came back, he married Chantal Delagneau in 1954. They ended up having 2 daughters, Marilyn and Manoëlle, and 2 sons, Fabrice and Fabien. He worked at the military base nearby for quite a while before becoming a school bus driver, and during his marriage with Chantal, they fostered children from the DAS, likely because they wanted to make extra cash, because you do get extra money for fostering children. Out of the 5 foster children they looked after, 3 of them were the Weiss children, and Jacqueline Weiss is one of the girls who would later go missing. After 24 years of marriage with Chantal, he divorced her in 1978, and then he moved in with Gilberte Binoche Le Menorel, so she was the one who knew Sylviane Lesage and who essentially reported her missing to Jacques Moreau. He still worked as a bus driver, mainly shuttling the girls between their school institution and their home, and overall he was very well liked by the town. However, Jacques Moreau knew him quite well. Obviously, Jacques Moreau's mother-in-law lived with Emile Louis, so he had quite a few interactions with him. And he said that he was a very shifty character. I mean, a lot of people did like him. He was like a guy who you could easily get along with, I guess, but he had just this shifty behavior. He could never really maintain eye contact with you. He would always kind of like look down. But 2 of the children Gilberte had been looking after complained to Jacques Moreau and his wife that Emile Louis had been inappropriately touching them. He would sexually assault them while helping them take a bath. So when Jacques Moreau found out about this, he confronted Emile, who immediately confessed to having these really bad sexual impulses that he couldn't control, and he said, "I need help, man, because, I can't stop it." So Jacques immediately told him to go see a psychiatrist, which Emile did. He did go see a psychiatrist, but as soon as Jacques found out about what Emile had done, he told his friend Jean-Bert, and he added that to the file. Now, going back to Jean-Bert and his investigation, the officer was very involved because he also was a child of the DAS. So we have quite a few people in this entire case, in this entire story, who had been through the system. He was a bit of a wild card when it came to his job as a detective, but not everybody liked his methods, but you couldn't fault him for being passionate. He poured all of his energy into his cases, and he tried to get more information about where the girls were when they went missing and when they went missing, just to find out what was going on. He already had some pretty concerning evidence or information on Emile Louis, but he also found out that one of the girls, Françoise Lemoine, stayed in a hotel room that was rented out by Emile Louis, and that the last time Jacqueline Weiss was seen was before going to a train station, and she was escorted by Emile Louis. So by now, Jean-Bert is convinced that Emile is responsible for the murder of Sylviane Lesage, but also is responsible for the disappearances of the 7 girls, actually 6 girls, because at the time he only knew of those 6 girls. On December 28th, 1981, Emile Louis is placed in custody, and Jean-Bert started interrogating him. He brought this big file filled with information. I must admit, there wasn't a lot of physical evidence at all. I think a lot of it was just circumstantial. But he brought all this information, confronted Emile, and was hoping that under pressure Emile would crack and just reveal a detail or confess to something. Emile was quite smart. He quickly realized that a lot of these accusations were very serious and that Jean-Bert did have quite a lot of information on him. So he figured that if he confessed to the lowest crime that he was accused of, that they would probably leave him alone regarding the rest. It would be less suspicious. If he denied everything, they would still go after him, but if he confessed to a crime on that list, then they might be more lenient with the rest, and that's exactly what he did. He eventually confessed to behaving inappropriately with the foster children that he and his partner had been looking after. He said that ever since he was a teenager, he struggled with those sexual impulses, but it wasn't his fault. It was just this thing that came over him. He did get charged for the abduction and murder of Sylviane Lesage, but he denied everything, and he actually never went to jail for it. He did spend 3 years in prison for sexual assault against minors, but once he left prison in 1984, he moved to Draguignan in the southeast of France, and he got a job in a funeral home. He was living on a campsite, and Jean-Bert was convinced that Emile left Yonne because he knew that things were getting a bit spicy over there. He wanted to put some distance between the disappearances and himself. Jean-Bert knew that without any bodies, there couldn't be proof of murder, so he launched dozens and dozens of searches throughout the entire department. If he could have gotten away with it, he would literally have turned the entire department upside down, inside out, but unfortunately they didn't find anything. On June 26, 1984, he wrote 2 massive reports, one on the murder of Sylviane Lesage and then one on the 6 missing girls. Separately, there wasn't a lot of evidence or a lot of weight to the accusations against Emile Louis, but if you put the cases together, both reports together, it was obvious that he had something to do with these disappearances and the murder. Unfortunately, one of the reports never got filed properly, so the link was never made between the 2 situations, so between Sylviane's murder and the girls missing. And the judge who was looking after Sylviane's murder case turned down Jean-Bert's investigation. He closed her case by officially dismissing it, which meant that Emile could never face any charges for this. Even though he had been charged for her murder and her kidnapping. Because the case was dismissed, that was it. That was the end of it. And Jean-Bert's official report went missing. Basically, it was lost in that file. It had been misfiled, and it went missing for over a decade. A few years later, in 1999, Emile was arrested again. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for sexually assaulting and exposing himself to his neighbor's underage children. He managed to get the sentence reduced to 3 years instead of 5, and he got out in April 1992, which is also when he married Chantal Paradis, who was blissfully unaware of his controversial past. I do want to say there's 3 Chantals in this case. His first wife was named Chantal, and his second wife was Chantal as well, but one of the missing girls was named Chantal, so I do apologize if you get confused. But his first wife was Chantal, and now he married Chantal Paradis in 1992. In 1996, when the TV show Perdu de Vue exposed just how the entire justice system had let those girls down, it really brought the families of the victims together, and in July of that year they filed an official complaint and involved the media. Now, the public was on their side. Once they found out that nothing had been done to look for these girls or help find the girls back in the late 70s, they were just as outraged as the families of the victims. And the only reason the public didn't act back then is because genuinely they didn't know. No one had reported this, nobody cared, so that's why they couldn't, be offended or try and change things. But now the story was coming out. The families turned up to the courthouse, and they had actually brought TV and the media as well, and they wanted to speak to the judge, but they got escorted out straight away. He told them to press charges through their lawyers and to basically just leave. But the judge did end up reluctantly taking the case, but only because obviously it was a complaint, so you have to address the complaint. Basically, he had to make the decision whether or not he could reopen the case for the 7 missing girls or open a new case. The district attorney himself questioned whether or not they really needed to reopen this case because it was so old. He said it would no longer be an investigation. It would be straight up archaeology or paleontology. Like, he was just making it sound like, well, it's just so old, who even cares anymore? Just because they were over 20 years old doesn't mean it's no longer important. And because the case was so old, the judge felt no rush looking into this, so he refused to update the families. He took as long as he could to update them. Because they had filed a complaint, he needed to address it. So after a lot of pressure from the families' lawyers, he finally told the families in 1997 that they would not be revisiting this case. It was too old, so they wouldn't start a new investigation for the missing girls. The families appealed that decision to the Indictment Division of Paris. I'm not sure if I'm translating that right, but that's essentially La Cour d'Appel, the Indictment Division. That's what I found online. So they appealed this decision, they won. So the same year, the judge was forced to reopen an investigation for the missing girls. Now, by then, Jean-Bert had retired, but this case was his baby. He still wanted to be involved, and he offered to still be involved in this case as a witness. He was actually excited because he felt like he was finally getting answers, but sadly, on August 4th, 1997, Christian Jean-Bert was found dead in his garage. He had left a suicide note saying goodbye to his daughter, and the cause of death was ruled as a suicide. He had shot himself in the head with his rifle, and a lot of people actually questioned the suicide. It's a whole story in itself, and I won't cover it in this video because ultimately in this case it makes no difference. But basically there had been 2 gunshot wounds, so a lot of people argued that how could it be suicide if it's 2 gunshot wounds. Again, there was an autopsy performed. His official cause of death was suicide. Some people questioned it, but all you need to know in regards to this case is that Christian Jean-Bert sadly passed away in 1997, and he would never get to see the outcome of this case. Police, meanwhile, did not have access to his report. They still didn't have access to his report on Emile Louis. It was still missing. So they were running out of ideas to get information out of him. They tried to interrogate other girls who had been at the institutions or at the schools back when the other girls were also there. They got very little information because, again, these girls had mental disabilities, so the amount of the information they could get out of them was not very helpful for the case. They didn't know that much themselves. They even tried to see if maybe the girls could have been smuggled abroad as part of like a sex trafficking ring, but nothing came up. Stéphane did manage to get an interview with Emile Louis, which was quite hard to get. A lot of people were hounding him and knocking on his door, but he did let Stéphane speak to him. And Emile mostly talked about his childhood, which I already told you about, but that's mostly what he shared with Stéphane. He said that yes, he did know the girls. Obviously, he was their bus driver, but he said that he had no reason to harm them. He liked those girls. He had absolutely no reason to do anything against them. And he said that he was a scapegoat. He was being framed. Someone wanted him to pay for these crimes and, be the main suspect. But when Stéphane asked him who he thought was trying to frame him, Emile just said he knew that it was the Arabs down the road who had kidnapped these girls and who were trying to get him to take the blame. And I do want to disclose that there were no Arabs involved who had done anything wrong. That was just Emile's words. That was just what he was saying, but I do want to clarify that there were no other suspects, regardless of where they're from. By 2000, they still had nothing. The judge was being pressured to close the case because, it was already a really old case. I mean, it was an old event, but also because it was dragging on and they weren't getting any new information. The judge did believe Emile was guilty, but, even if they did manage to get him to confess, the problem was, in France, the statute of limitations for murder is like 10 years. I mean, it changed in 2017. It's now 15 years. So basically, after 10 years, you can't be held accountable for murder, I guess. So that's what the prosecution was dealing with. They needed to find a loophole, and they did. They wanted to charge Emile with sequestration and kidnapping because you couldn't prove that the girls had been murdered. So that means that you couldn't prove that the kidnapping had ended. So there was no statute of limitations, if that makes sense. So he would either confess to the murders, and that would be confession in itself, or he wouldn't, and then in this case, there would be no statute of limitations, and they could get him for kidnapping. Basically, they were trying to get any charges against him. It doesn't matter if it wasn't murder. They wanted to get him for something because, again, he couldn't be charged for murder. It would be very difficult to charge him for murder because of the statute of limitations. Finally, on December 12th, 2000, police turned up at Emile's house and they brought him to the police station. They had 48 hours to get information out of him, and if they didn't, then he would get to go home and they would be out of options. That was their last chance. They decided to just play their last card. They told Emile that the entire affair had expired. They told him about the statute of limitations. The girls had been missing for over 10 years, so whoever had done it could not get in trouble, and they essentially told him that, look, we know you did it. We know you kidnapped them and murdered them. Just tell us what happened so we can finally close this case. You can't get in trouble legally for this, so just go ahead and confess, right? And Emile was not stupid at all, so he was like, right, show me the legal text to confirm what you're saying to me because I don't believe you. And they did, because again, there was legal text to prove this. So they showed him this text, and once he was happy with that information, he said, okay, so I can start now. He confessed to having murdered all 7 girls. He started with Françoise Lemoine. He said that they had been lovers for about a year, and he would take her to his favorite fishing spot so that they could make love. And that's where he killed her. However, he told police that he blacked out mentally and a beast took over him, pushing him to kill. So his initial intent wasn't to kill Françoise Lemoine, it was just to have sex with her. But as they were having sex, something took over, this beast took over him. And it's only once he snapped out of it that he realized that she was dead. Jacqueline Weiss was the other girl he killed in a similar fashion, but overall he said that he, again, never meant to kill any of these girls. He only identified or remembered the names of 2 of the girls, so Jacqueline Weiss and Françoise Lemoine. He did identify all 7 girls through photographs, and again, that was normal. He knew them from driving the bus anyway. He never pretended he didn't know them. But he said that he couldn't remember the 5 other girls. All he could give was like specific information that actually ended up being very useful. So he could remember specific details or ages or dates or locations, and for every single one of those 5 victims, police could pinpoint who he was talking about. So for example, when he was talking about Bernadette Lemoine, he said that she was bald. That's all he could remember about her. And the day before she went missing, she actually had to have her head shaved because she had really bad lice. So that matched up, and there were quite a few of them like that. So for the other 5 victims, all of the information he gave about them did match up in some way. So they managed to link up all 7 victims to the crimes he had committed. And he actually offered to take police up to the spots where he had buried them. So they were like, all right, let's go. We got 48 hours. They drove him up to the Seran River, which is a river that flows through the Yonne, and he had buried all 7 of them along the riverbank. He precisely pointed out where all 7 were, and after 48 hours, basically once the 48 hours were over, he basically told police, "This was so much fun, let's not do this again. I'm going home for dinner, I'm gonna have dinner with my wife, bye." And police were like, no, you're being arrested for the murder and kidnappings of the 7 girls. And it took him a while to realize that they were not pranking him. He was like, "No, well, the case expired, so we're fine." And police were like, "No, it's still, at the judge's discretion, so you're staying in jail tonight." And even his lawyer had to tell him, like, "Look, you're staying in jail tonight. There's nothing we can do." Though the lawyer did defend, obviously, that's his job. He did defend Emile and told police, "My client only confessed because he was told he couldn't get in trouble, and he didn't do any of these things. He just gave you information because he thought that you would finally leave him alone if he told you a story." That would be easier to believe if they didn't go on to dig up the 7 spots he had pointed out to police. So Emile is finally incarcerated while awaiting a decision from the judge. The families finally realized that the girls were not going to be coming home, which was very, very hard on them. I think they all secretly hoped that then maybe they had been kidnapped and they were somewhere else, or maybe they were in a sex trafficking ring, still alive, basically. So this was really sad to them to realize that none of them would be coming home. They had all been dead for, 20 years now? Over 20 years. Police started digging. After 3 days of digging, they found the remains and clothing of Madeleine de Juste. In the other locations, they found burned clothing, a suitcase filled with clothes, and another body, and that was the body of Jacqueline Weiss. Both girls had been found just like Sylviane Lesage, with their hands and feet tied, and they had also been gagged. And the suitcase filled with clothes actually proved that the clothes had belonged to the deaths. However, the name tags had been removed, so we didn't know who the clothes belonged to individually. However, they had been clothes provided by the deaths. Finding the victims meant that it was over for Emile. If he had simply vaguely confessed to having murdered the girls or kidnapped them, then he could always go back on his word and say that he lied. It would be really hard to prove that he had actually done any of that, but he had been too precise and confident when showing them the spots where the girls were, so he could no longer deny his involvement. Because how could he have known where the victims were going to be? Of course, he told police that he didn't actually know the 2 girls would be found there. He said he just guessed those spots because one day, ages ago, he'd seen 2 people walk by with big bags that he felt could have been carrying or could have been containing bodies. That was his reasoning. He's like, "Look, guys, you're going to laugh. This is hilarious. You're never going to believe this. I saw these people carrying bags, and I thought later on, well, maybe what if those bags did have a body in them? So I'll just give you the spots where, the body might be." And then coincidentally, 2 of them are a match. That's just wild, but I didn't do anything. He kept just talking about the Arabs from Auxerre, who was responsible for these crimes. Obviously, they were not. Emile was busy trying to find excuses, coming up with an alibi or some sort of reasoning, but the lawyers of the victims' families were trying to prove that he had committed acts that were not past the statute of limitations, because if they were, then he would get to walk free, he would never face the charges, and that was unacceptable. So what they had to do was they had to prove that from the time the case had started, there had been something going on less than 10 years after. I'm not explaining that right. Basically, the way it works is that once you open up a case, you have 10 years to not go past the statute of limitations. So it's not from the time of the actual disappearance or murder or whatever it is. It's from the time the case is opened, but every time something is added to the case, it restarts the clock. So they found a letter from 1993 that basically was just 9 years after the case had been officially started in 1984 by Jambert in his report. So that meant that after 1983, it restarted the 10 years, and it was still 2000 or maybe 2001. So that meant that they were still within the statute of limitations, so they could still charge him. He could still be going to trial to face his crimes and to face his charges. Additionally, Chantal Paradis, so I don't know if she was his ex-wife yet, but his second wife, she came forward and said that he had tortured her and abused her, as well as her 14-year-old daughter at the time, Karine Paradis. She said that she waited until he was in prison to come forward, first of all because she was terrified of him, but also because she was deeply ashamed of what he had done to her. Emile initially confirmed what she had accused him of, and then went back on his confession and said that that's just how they like to play and have sex. However, a lot of his neighbors and friends, all women, came forward and said that he had also submitted them to rape and horrible scenes of torture. So it wasn't just Karine Paradis and Chantal Paradis, it was also neighbors and other friends he had attacked. He knew how to choose his victims. He would go for people who were weak or easy targets, and if that person wasn't weak or an easy target, he would simply drug them until they passed out, and then he would go on to torture and rape them. And he claimed that they were all liars. In court, he tried to gaslight them all, and he talked down to them. He was an absolute nightmare. In March 2004, though, he was sentenced to 20 years for rape and torture against his ex-wife Chantal Paradis and stepdaughter Karine Paradis. Emile's own daughter, Marilyn, his first child, I believe, came forward. She told police that Emile had started sexually assaulting her when she was only 5 years old, but she never told her mother because her mother was quite physically abusive as well. She wasn't much better than Emile, and her mother had also made her promise to not confess to anything until she was dead, so now she finally could come forward. She also said that Jacqueline Weiss, who was fostered with them, she was in that household. When she joined the house, Emile was immediately obsessed with her. He really took a liking to her, and he would spend more time with her than anyone else combined in that house, even his own wife, even his own kids. He had also drugged his daughter Marilyn before taking her to a shed and sexually assaulting her. She felt very guilty for not coming forward sooner because it could have helped the case against Emile, but again, you can't possibly be upset at her for any of that because she was just a child and she had gone through so much. On November 30th, 2004, so almost 30 years after the crimes, Emile Louis finally faced trial for the 7 murdered girls. He denied everything. He said that the accusations were lies. He had only confessed to police because he wanted them to leave him alone. He had been told he couldn't get in trouble, so that's why he confessed to whatever. It's not his fault that they actually found bodies where he pointed out where the bodies were. He claimed again that he had no reason to kill these girls because he liked them. Now, the trial was obviously very painful for the families of the victims because everyone had to be brought back on a bus to the spots where Emile had buried the girls. So they were all brought back to that spot, and he pointed to the spots again, even though he denied that he had anything to do with this. And it was just awful for the families to see where their loved ones had been buried, even though they only found 2 out of the 7. And also because he got to go on a little field trip. He was on the bus, got off the bus, went for a pee, and then walked around, pointed to the 7 spots where he buried the girls, and then just went back to court and still blamed Arabs from down the street. Before the trial, actually, Emile said, "You'll see once I'm in court, I'm gonna start dropping names. You'll see who's really behind this," but he never did. He never gave any names. He had nothing to say. He was just talking absolute shit. In a last attempt to get a reaction from Emile, because he wasn't reacting to anything, he was denying everything. In court, he was very at ease, almost like he was just kind of hanging there, just about to order a drink. So they were trying to get a reaction from him, and they showed him pictures of one of the girls, one of the bodies found. And the picture was the pictures were initially only given to the jury, and they all agreed that the pictures were very, very difficult to look at because obviously this was 25 years after the murder. So, the body was in quite an advanced state of decomposition, and the girls had been bound and gagged. But when he was shown the picture, he smiled, and a lot of people interpreted that as he was proud of his old work. So that was really messed up. On November 24th, 2004, he was finally sentenced to life in prison for the abductions and murders of the 7 girls. Now, while the families were happy to finally get justice, they were still very upset that he hadn't shared how he kidnapped them or why, or really didn't really give much information about these girls. And that's what's really sad as well, is we don't really know much about these girls. I can't tell you what they were like. I can't tell you what they were into. I have so little information, and it would be really nice to be able to remember them as more than his victims. They deserved none of that. And it was just devastating that they only found 2 out of the 7 girls, possibly because they had all been buried in soft dirt near the river. So it's possible that either through exposure to the elements or just like being so close to the river, they went into the river. Maybe that's where they ended up. Either way, it's just very sad that we don't get more information about these girls. He tried to appeal the sentence for the first trial regarding his ex-wife and stepdaughter. They actually gave him an additional 10 years in the appeal, so he was given 20 years, and in the appeal they gave him 30 with a minimum sentence of 20 years. But it didn't matter because he was spending the rest of his life in prison anyway. He also appealed the second trial, so the one for the 7 girls. He was given the exact same sentence again, life in prison, minimum of 18 years. He also had to pay financial compensation for the families of the victims. Emile was 70 years old when both trials happened. He would be spending the rest of his life in prison anyway, but he was quite old when these trials happened. And he actually ended up going to the same prison as Francis Ulm. I covered his story a few months ago on my channel, The Criminal Backpacker. He was also in the same prison as Guy Georges, who was another prolific serial killer. He would often play with both of them in the courtyard. I'm sure they had a lot in common. He passed away of old age on October 20th, 2013 at the age of 79. The biggest scandal with this case wasn't just Emile and what he had done to those girls. It was the fact that when those girls went missing, nobody seemed to care. Because they were orphans, they were mentally disabled, the institutions just were very happy to call it a runaway case and just wash their hands of this. They didn't want to launch an investigation. Nobody cared. That's exactly what it was like at the time. Literally nobody cared. Everybody knew that if the girls had been the daughters of a wealthy politician or a judge, people would have looked into this. Police would have been involved from the get-go. I do want to say police did do their work in this case. It's just that, unfortunately, there was no investigation until someone deemed it interesting enough or important enough. However, I do want to say, as sad as it is that these girls fell through the cracks for so long, Pierre Monnoir, Christian Jambert, and Stéphane Munca are the real superheroes of this case, honest to God. Jambert was the first to deep dive into this case when he was assigned the investigation for Sylviane Lesage. And even though his findings were ignored for over a decade, and unfortunately he passed away before he could see the final outcome of all of his research, it was essential, it was crucial in getting Emile Louis. Without his information, without his investigation, we would have nothing against him. Pierre Monnoir wasn't even related to any of the girls. He had heard a vague rumor about them, and he just took it upon himself. He cared enough to deep dive again into these disappearances and reach out to Stéphane, who did a tremendous job tracking down the families of the victims, bringing attention to this story with that TV show. They could have done like everybody else. They could have completely dismissed these disappearances, called them runaways, and it's just, I don't know, in a way it's amazing that these 3 men who had very little to gain from solving this case cared so much that after 30 years the girls finally got some form of justice. The judges and attorneys who kept shutting down this case never faced any consequences for not caring about this and letting the entire story slide, which is just absolutely shocking. But I do want to say what's very sad as well is that because of those 7 disappearances, the murder of Sylviane Lesage was very much in the background. She didn't get as much attention as the other girls, and she actually never did really get justice because her case was dismissed, which is very sad indeed, because obviously I believe everyone believes Emile Louis was behind her murder. It's just that the judge dismissed the case. So sadly, she didn't get the same amount of attention as the other girls, but Jean-Bert did really care about her case, and he did research it as much as he could. That's it for today's video, guys. I hope you like this story. It is a huge case in France, absolutely huge. I mean, it is a bit old, but it is massive. Everybody knows of Emile Louis in France. He is one of the biggest serial killers, and I just wanted to share this with you. My camera's gonna die, so I'm just gonna have to wrap up this video here, but let me know what you thought of this story in the comments down below, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.